Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Cold Spring Park Problems, Progress, and Possibilities, the second webinar in the spring webinar series presented by Newton Conservators. As most of you probably know, Newton Conservators is a nonprofit established in 1961 that works to preserve and to maintain open space in Newton. For more information about our organization, check our website, which is newtonconservators.org. We'd love to have you become a member while you're there. New members get a trail guide as a welcome gift. My name is Beth Wilkinson, and I'll be the moderator of this virtual event. Barbara Bates will provide technical assistance. With that business out of the way, let's turn to the important part of the evening, letting Alan Nogee take us on a tour of Cold Spring Park. Alan is the president of the Friends of Cold Spring Park, which he founded in 2018. He grew up in Newton Highlands, playing in Cold Spring Park in the 1960s, and then moved back in 2003. Alan is a mostly retired career environmentalist, having worked as the Clean Energy Program Director for the Union of Concerned Scientists with other nonprofits. Alan won an award from Newton Conservators in 2020 for his work with Friends of Cold Spring Park, most deservedly so. He's here to share his extensive knowledge of the park and its issues with us tonight. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks to the Newton Conservators for providing this opportunity. Really appreciate it. Appreciate everybody coming tonight. Looks like we have great attendance. So welcome to this virtual tour of Cold Spring Park. And my main qualification for being able to speak to you tonight, as Beth said, really I've just been coming to the park longer than most of you, and it's always been one of my favorite places. But I'm going to try to channel some people who've taught me a lot about the park since then. Sam Jaffe, who I hope many of you attended the keynote presentation that he gave that kicked off our public campaign. Sam grew up in Cold Spring Park, skipped school to go there, and probably knows more about it than anyone. But also Newton biologists, Dan Perlman and Eric Olson, who spend an enormous amount of time in the park and have educated a lot of people about it. Richard Premack. And from the Conservators, many people, but especially Beth Wilkinson and Catherine Howard, who have been very involved in helping to get us off the ground, and we really appreciate it. Also, I've been able to teach myself a lot about the park, thanks to two apps, which are actually related. I like to use the Seek app, which is just a very simpler version of the iNaturalist app. Both of which are available for your smartphone and also at iNaturalist.org. They allow you to identify plants and animals in the park or anywhere. You can post to iNaturalist. I like Seek because I think it's the version of iNaturalist designed for students and kids, and it's easier to use. But as you can see, it helps you identify lots of plants, lots of animals, and creates a map of where they're located. It's not terribly accurate, but it can definitely help identify where things are in parts of the park. It's a terrific resource, highly recommend it. And if you use it, you're also helping to build up a scientific database. You can join a Cold Spring Park Biological Inventory project and make data available for scientists to use. So some people have trouble finding Cold Spring Park, and there it is. I show you this really because I want to, make sure we're situated in the global context. There we are, about halfway between our territory in Greenland and Miami, and in a nice temperate location. But let's zoom in and get a closer look. I like this view because you can see at the bottom of the page is Cold Spring Park. As we rotate around, the bottom of the page is becoming the Newton Cemetery. And in some ways, it's really one large green space. Together, we're the largest green space in all of Newton, even about 60% bigger than Webster Woods. Of course, the cemetery is managed very differently from the park, but in some ways, it's one big park with many habitats. And one of the really exciting things about Cold Spring Park that makes it such an interesting place to explore is the fact that we have so many diverse habitats in the park, from glacial hillsides to water features, white pines along the aqueduct, grassy barrens, cottonwood grove, and red maple forest and swamp. Each of these has different plant and animal communities, and we'll be exploring those in more detail tonight. We have a really great diversity of plants in Cold Spring Park, including at least 35 edible plants identified by Newton edible plant expert Russ Cohen, and about 9 that I've added since then. Some of them are natives, some are invasives. We'll talk a little more about them. Just as you come into the park, there's this beautiful stand of sunflowers, Jerusalem artichoke, by the end of the summer. Please don't pick and eat any of these plants. This is for identification purposes so that we can learn. Also, another great resource is eBird, ebird.org, where birders record their observations, their sightings, and Cold Spring Park is listed as a hotspot in eBird. You can, if you get the ebird.org web app, or you just go to their site, you can look up Cold Spring Park under hotspots, and you'll see that there's 165 species that have been observed in the park, a really healthy number, thanks to the diverse habitats that we have. Of course, the park has had problems too for a long time. Trails have been a big problem. As I'm sure most of you know, we've had a lot of tripping hazards from exposed roots and rocks, flooding, areas that are perpetually muddy, a lack of navigation aids. We've had issues with degraded habitat, and we've had threats of green space loss over the including the proposal to site the senior center in Cold Spring Park 2 years ago, a proposal to site a new middle school in the park about 25 years ago, to extend housing on Wilbur Street into the park before that. Cold Spring Park needs permanent protection from development. It's about time we recognize that the natural spaces, in particular in Cold Spring Park, deserve to stay that way. Now, moving to the trail. In 2018, as you basically left the parking lot and headed south along the main Life Course Trail, this is what it looked like. It was almost perpetually muddy. There are a couple of boards that some volunteers had put there to help try to navigate them, but it wasn't easy, especially for seniors. In 2019, just as we were getting organized, Eagle Scout candidate Alex Rivero recruited a bunch of his scout troop to help build some boardwalks in this area that made it much more navigable. And last year, we completed a stone dust restoration of part of the trail, and this is what it looks like today. Nice and dry, at least most of the time. It was a really big collaborative effort. We had the support of the neighborhood councils in Highlands and Waban, all 6 of the city councilors from wards 5 and 6, both current councilors and past councilor John Rice, as well as members of our board here in the picture. This is me handing a pseudo check to Mayor Fuller for our contribution to restoring the park. Also in the picture are Parks and Rec Commissioner Nicole Banks and Luis Demarici, who really was responsible for the design of the park. Stephanie Lapham, who was a really important liaison, particularly in the early days. We really thank the city and the Parks and Recreation and Culture Department for helping to pull this together. The slide shows you the area that we restored last year in red, basically from the Zervis School all the way to the Beacon Street parking lot, up to Dunkley Street, excuse me, and then an interior trail to the dog park. This is about half the trail, and it included most of the areas that are frequently muddy, and a lot of areas that were also very rocky. This year, we're looking to extend the restoration of the stone dust surface along the Cottonwood Aqueduct, which you can see here at the bottom. This is a really important area of the park, and Luis told me just yesterday, day before yesterday, that work should start either the end of this month or in June. So we're extremely excited about that. This section of the trail is the most used section of the Cold Spring Park Life course. This is a Strava heat map that basically shows by the density of the color and by the red area here that this is the most used area by runners tracking their workouts on Strava. And that's from a combination of people circling the track, as the high school track teams do, for example, and people going straight through on the aqueduct. So it's an extremely busy portion of the park. It's also used, of course, by walkers, hikers, by shoppers, taking the aqueduct to Four Corners and Whole Foods in particular, and the other stores located there. But as you can see in the left two pictures here, parts of it are extremely rocky, have very high exposed roots, really have presented tripping hazards. This woman I came across last year had fallen and sprained her ankle, had to be carried off the trail by her companion all the way from the aqueduct to the Beacon Street parking lot. We have reports of many injuries in the trail. One of the really cool features of the Aqueduct Trail and Cold Spring Park is that there's actually an 8-mile loop along both aqueducts, the Cottonwood Aqueduct and the Sudbury Aqueduct. You can start off anywhere on this loop, go through Woburn Center down to the Charles River, and take Quinnipiquin Road Trail, which is due to be fixed up shortly by the state to see big improvements, explore Hemlock Grove, return by the Sudbury Aqueduct. There's an awkward detour over the Green Line here, but then the Sudbury Aqueduct goes to Newton Center Playground and Park, and then you can come back to Cold Spring Park. You could add another loop there, 1.5 miles around Cold Spring Park. It's really quite an incredible hike for a suburban location like ours to be mostly on green space. However, everything's not completely okay, even after the restoration. This is shot during a rainstorm last December, where the brook is completely overflowing the bridge behind the parking lot that starts really the headwaters to the head of the trail. You cross over that, and even the next stretch of trail was completely underwater. In fact, as you can see, there are ducks swimming on the trail where it should be dry. Fortunately, however, the trail hasn't washed away as a result of several times where the brook has overflowed there this winter. And we're looking at the city has actually now got approval. The Department of Public Works got approval from the Conservation Commission to do some dredging behind and to the left of the bridge as we showed it, and possibly 200 feet downstream. This may not take place till next spring, but it should help alleviate a lot of the flooding in this room. And we're really grateful for DPW and the Conservation Commission for permitting that to happen. This is another section of the trail between the parking lot and Zervis, also during one of those 3 rainstorms last year. That's the interior of the park, panning over the trail itself to the brook, which has, as you can see, completely overflowed onto the trail. In part, at least, that's caused by 3 logs across the stream, which DPW and the Department of Urban Forestry have agreed to try to remove. We were hopeful they were going to get to that this winter, but they had a very, very busy winter. We're unable to get to it, but we're hoping that that will happen soon, and that will alleviate some of the flooding at that part of the trail. The trickiest part of the trail, unfortunately, is this stormwater discharge right below the intersection of Wilbur and Winslow, that basically overflows onto the trail to Zervis. As you can see, during a heavy rainstorm, this area turns into a brook itself, and it remains wet for really some time afterwards. Last year, actually 2 years ago, fortunately, Eagle Scout candidate Alex Rivero and one of our board members, a very initial board member, got his troop together, and they helped install some boardwalks in this location. Last year, Matthew Honig, another scout, led his troop and his Eagle Scout project to extend the boardwalks there, to move some that were no longer needed by the Zervis, by the bridge behind the parking lot, so that we now have a pretty good, as you can see on the left, these boardwalks have helped navigate that area. This is 1 or 2 days after a rainstorm, but as you can see, there's still significant gaps there. This is a tricky section. DPW surveyed it at our request to see if they could do something to divert the stormwater outfall so that it would no longer discharge onto the trail. Unfortunately, that doesn't look very promising. They think that even if they were able to divert it further into the park interior, it would just flow back onto the trail because it's lower. There's a couple of potential solutions. If they are able to just divert the stormwater outfall, and we were able to do a standard stone dust restoration, it might only cost $8,000. More complex, the trail could be raised with drainage installed on one side and underneath. That raises the cost significantly. But most likely, the only permanent solution would be to build a 6 to 8 foot wide boardwalk in that section of the trail. That would cost something in the order of $50,000 to $100,000 and would likely require a grant from either the community preservation funds or from the state. So we have deferred looking at that in the interim until we finish the aqueduct, sure how much that costs, and then we'll look at this. But this is a high priority because this is a real backdoor to Zervis. It's used by a lot of students. It would be great to be able to have that accessible in all weather. This is the wash below Plymouth Road, what it looks like during a heavy rainstorm, another brook and major flood. And this actually is where Cold Spring Brook originates, or used to originate before it flows back here and then under the dog park and the softball field and a culvert emptying out on the other side of the dog park. It's incredibly wet during rainstorms, but it tends to dry out, mostly dry out within 24 to 48 hours, so it shouldn't require major renovation. If we restored all the way from Plymouth Road to Vaughan Ave, that would be the cost. If we only patch the wettest areas like the corner I just showed you and a little bit behind the softball field, it would be a lot less. Again, we are waiting to see what the aqueduct costs. Current estimate is about $20,000. We should get the detailed design work and have a firm budget estimate very soon. Now, navigation is also reportedly a problem in Cold Spring Park, which is hard to understand because we do have directional signs in several places of the park, and they're pretty clear which way you should go. So we're trying to address that issue as well. As I hope most of you know, we've installed a kiosk at the back of the Beacon Street parking lot just last year. This was designed and built by biology professor Eric Olson, now retired from Brandeis University, and was installed with the help of both the Riveros from the previous Scout trip and Matthew Honig and his parents, along with Stephanie Lapham from Parks and Rec. And there's Eric Olson. They did a fantastic job building this. It should last for a very long time. The park now has a detailed map on the kiosk that shows the various habitats as well as exercise stations and other features in the park, and a rotating display that includes what's in bloom any particular month and invasive species that inhabit the park that we're going to be talking about soon, as well as notices. Just today, Parks, Recreation, and Culture completed an orienteering course in Cold Spring Park. This is basically a recreational activity by which you have a map and a compass with very detailed markings and angles that you learn to navigate using a map and compass. Particular spots are marked by a post with a lettering that corresponds to the map and a QR code, which if you scan it with your camera, leads to descriptions. Some of them are orienteering instructions, and some of them describe some of the park features that you're seeing basically in front of you, including some of the natural features. So this should be a great addition to our park, and also is been installed in 4 other parks with progressive levels of difficulty. Pretty exciting developments. We also hope to put simpler directional signs on the sides of the posts here, so you'll have clearer directions whether you're going to the dog park versus Zervis, and be able to navigate around the park much easier. So now we're going to start our tour of the park, leaving the parking lot and walking south clockwise around the park. First place that we come to, I've nicknamed here Witch Hazel Rise, because there's 8 or 9 witch hazel shrubs. This also basically, this is a very tentative nickname because we are starting a project with the blessing of Parks and Recreation to informally name some of the landmarks around the park that will then appear on at least our maps. It can appear on the kiosk map, and we'll be involving park users in this project. That should be really fun. This is one of my favorite spots. Witch hazel is the last blooming shrub or plant in the park. This picture was taken on November 1st, which is about when they come into bloom, or around Halloween, basically, and they were in bloom through much of December. They're tiny little yellow flowers. I've circled it so you can see them up close. They're really beautiful. And the witch hazel shrub is really amazing. This I discovered through Seek. In the summer, they develop these witch hazel leaf galls, which look like little witches' caps. And these are basically structures that are built by the plant in response to this witch hazel leaf gall aphid, which has this really ridiculously incredible lifestyle, which is described on this slide, where in springs, female hatch from eggs laid before the winter. They inject a substance into the witch hazel leaf, which induces galls to form around the aphid. The female aphid then reproduces asexually inside the gall, produces 50 to 60 young, which develop wings and basically in the spring and fly to birches to feed. It really illustrates this incredible symbiosis and interdependence among plants and insects where so many of them are actually very highly specialized. This aphid basically needs both witch hazel and birches nearby. After it flies to the birches, it basically feed on those leaves and create galls on the birches, giving birth to another generation, which flies back in the second summer to the witch hazel, laying more eggs, repeating. It's incredibly complicated and actually I think still somewhat of a mystery since I've read 3 different descriptions on the web and all of them are very slightly different. And then there's the witch hazel leaf roller moth, another specialist only on witch hazels, which I have yet to observe. Moving along, we come to one of the park's vernal pools, really pretty during some parts of the year, other parts of the year totally covered with algae. Still pretty if you can appreciate the algae at work in the pond. And then it's on to the small meadow at the intersection of the main life course trail with a trail from Beaconwood to the dog park. This small meadow a couple of years ago was completely inhabited by tree of heaven, ailanthus trees, a highly invasive tree from Asia, which you can see volunteers at work at. Several days of volunteer work in total were required here by about a dozen people. Also on the other side of the trail, between the trail and the vernal pool, a couple of volunteers taking out Japanese knotweed, mowing it. And we are having cleared for the moment these areas of invasives, though it's an ongoing project because they come back and back and back. We're hoping to reestablish a native plant meadow in this area. And it's got a little help from nature last year, blowing down about 5 large, mature tree of heaven from the opposite side of the meadow, which we recently cleared. But by last summer, we were already seeing a really nice stand of milkweed, black raspberry, some goldenrod that bloomed behind that. As you may know, milkweed being the only host plant for the monarch butterfly, whose population is down 90% and needs all the help that we can give it. Parks and Rec has also been really helpful here. They have promised to mow the meadow annually, which is important to maintain it, and will come back several times a year to knock back the Japanese knotweed, which should weaken it and eventually allow some native plantings on that side of the path. The meadow has some incredible inhabitants. Last year I came across Alexander Guman, gentleman sitting and lying down in the meadow, taking pictures with a macro lens of some of its insect inhabitants. This really colorful fruit fly here, red-headed bush cricket, excuse me, a harvest man, and my favorite creature in the small meadow, the jagged ambush bug. Now this one, I can't believe that some science fiction authors and movie directors haven't created a film around a Godzilla size or even just an 8-foot size jagged ambush bug. Can you imagine coming across that? It grabs you with its pinchers, it fixates you with its basketball size eyes, then it stabs you with its proboscis, injecting toxin that liquefies your entire insides and sucks it out through that as a straw. And that's that. And this is what it does to a bunch of insects, some of them pests, some of them not pests. But it plays a role like all the organisms in the park. It's a native insect. Fortunately, it's only ½ an inch in length. And so it still gives a nasty sting if you happen to come across one. A little detour down the Beaconwood path and a side path here to the Cardinals coat of arms. I'm not going to give you the whole history here if you're interested in the history, and it's a really interesting one. It's one of the most distinctive pieces of trash that were discarded in the park before it became a park in the 1930s. You can read that great story and others in Michael Clark's Mysteries of Cold Spring Park article that's on the Conservators website. The short story is a cardinal from BC basically had this sculpted, but the sculptor got it wrong and did French fleur-de-lis instead of course, the Irish shamrocks that he was supposed to do. So that's that. This is also right next to the largest vernal pool in the park. It's a certified vernal pool, though it never dries up anymore. And this whole section of the park has been getting wetter and wetter over the years. Has turtles and other wildlife. Another view of it from the trail where it wraps around. It's on really both sides of the Beaconwood Trail, connected by a tunnel under the trail, a culvert under the trail. Moving further on, we're coming to what I've tentatively nicknamed our Chestnut Hill, because it's got 5 or 6 chestnut trees. I was so excited when I discovered this because, as you probably know, we had billions of chestnut trees once upon a time in this country, but were all wiped out by the chestnut blight. I thought this was like incredibly great that we have them growing here, but it turns out the young trees grow in a lot of places. It's not until they reach their adolescence and start to develop the chestnut fruit that they get felled by the blight. So that's likely going to be the fate of these here as well. But this section also has some really other nice native shrubs, the maple leaf viburnum, which flowers out in May, June, really nice white flowers, and berries later on in the fall, where the leaves also turn a really bright scarlet. There's blueberries on the hill, could nickname it Blueberry Hill. There's also some hazelnut tree babies. It's a really pretty part of the park. So on to the aqueduct, which is, got beautiful in the winter as well as other times of years. We've got a brand new bench in the aqueduct donated by the Eldridge family, dedicated to Larry Elbridge, also known as the Mighty L, someone who walked the park frequently. The bench also marks the spot where a small footpath diverges from the trail. Oh, that was the inauguration of the bench. Hope you didn't miss that. The footpath has interestingly been basically decorated by a local sculptor. Not sure this was the right thing to do, but it's pretty interesting that he's carved some hearts into several of the stumps that were left on the trail. These were dead trees. Also carved a love sign that's leaning up against the tree near the middle heart there. And there's another one etched onto another dead tree. Pretty interesting area. There's a really nice glacial esker behind the aqueduct with a lot of pine trees and maple trees. Also, it illustrates the fact that the pine trees along the entire aqueduct, which were planted in the 1840s when the aqueduct was built, basically are under attack by Norway maples, which are an invasive street tree that was planted heavily in the 40s and 50s, which unfortunately is wreaking havoc in the park, both here and on the hillside, the other opposite, where I'll show in a minute, as well as in many places in Newton. It shades out other native seedlings from germinating. It has very shallow roots that suck up all the water. It has a dense canopy which blocks the sun. Not a nice tree. Moving on, we come to the site of the original cold spring, which has now been buried. This is a map of the stream right before the new brook was dredged. I think the original brook is this one that curves off to the west, and this straight line looks like is a more recent addition. But basically, this beginning of the Cold Spring brook was put underground in the 1930s, and a new brook was dredged, much straighter, with branches towards Beaconwood and then branches hooking west towards Zervis. This dredging is what lowered the original swamp and exposed the playing fields originally that are now the off-leash dog park and the old softball field. The brook is scheduled to be dredged again around 2026, tentatively speaking, but that really depends on a rapidly changing environment. This area was also originally owned by the Atlas Film Corporation, which filmed Westerns there. As you can see, here's where it looks like with the current neighborhood. They owned most of the park below the aqueduct here, up to where Puritan Road is, as well as the top of the hill. And 100 years later, again, it became a film site for Defending Jacob. This is where the murder took place, and the body was discovered right at the old headwaters of the Cold Spring Brook. It's also a nearby house, which is the site of a real murder mystery, which fortunately didn't take place in the house or in the park. And that's a story that I'm actually just teasing you with. I'm going to do that for another time. But this is undoubtedly our most famous abutter in the park, because just guessing that, but I can't imagine that anyone else had a front page headline like that in the Boston Globe. Moving on, we have the dog park and some ground nesting bees, as well as habitat for the dogs. The shot of the dog park in early winter, you can see the line of pine trees along the aqueduct very clearly. Nice shot in winter. All the nicest photos in this presentation were taken by Bill Joplin, who's probably the only person who spends more time in the park than I do, and is a person who's helped maintain the trails in the interior of the park over many, many years. Interestingly, I learned this from the Sam Jaffe presentation. In the dog park, we have a lot of ground nesting bees. You can see here a little unequal cellophane bee poking its head up out of what look like these large anthills. These bees are only active for about a month in the spring, and they basically pollinate. They help pollinate red maples, get their nectar from red maples and from willows. And here's even some bee porn. Two cellophane bees mating. Moving on, the Cold Spring Park emerges from under the dog park and the softball field. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the old softball field later, taken by Ken Mallory. The trail then winds around by an old bubbler. This is perhaps the oldest oak tree in the park. It looks to be close to 300 years old. Oak trees are incredibly important. They support more than 500 species of caterpillar, more than any other plant, and many, many other organisms as well. You can see here how the Norway maples are all leafed out before the oaks, making it very difficult, if not impossible, for new oaks to germinate. As many of the old oaks die, we're not really sure what's going to happen. There's some gorgeous flowers along this part of the trail, some trout lilies, which are now in bloom, some jack in the pulpit, which are just coming into bloom here and along the trail in the wetlands. Toadshade, we're apparently in the 2007 Conservators census, we're the only park with 3 species of trillium in the park, the red, the purple, the white, really beautiful native flower. It's much loved by wildlife. Moving along, there's Muskrat Pond, 3 huge pine trees around the pond that serve as roosting spots for owls. There's frequently great horned owls and barred owls in the park, particularly in the fall. Moving along Cottonwood Alley, we're told that this is actually a pretty unusual cotton grove for this far east. The normal habitat is basically at the Connecticut River, starts west of the Connecticut River, though there's scattered cottonwood trees further east than that. A tree that is much loved by wildlife. Was sacred to Native Americans because of the shade that it brought along riverbanks that were much needed, and also much very important to keeping rivers cool to create trout habitat. Another shot by Bill, another season. And then we come to this beautiful part of the trail that leads to Zervis, the part that floods a lot before. Northern spice bush, one of my favorite bushes, just finished blooming in the spring. In a very important bush for birds and the only main host plant for the spice bush swallowtail butterfly and caterpillar. This area also includes the spot that's been studied by Professor Perlman over the years. He every month or twice a month takes a picture of the same spot as it changes through the seasons on this trail, and he's tracked it over 20 years to basically document changes in this spot that he basically calls a spot, but that has yielded some important lessons. Some more beautiful native shrubs along this trail, along with the also cute spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. Those are not real eyes, by the way. They're fake eyes so that it looks like a snake and nobody will eat it. But we have beautiful sweet pepper bush that blooms in July, black elderberry in June, jewelweed in the late summer, or touch me not, all along this trail. Really nice stuff. And finally, a tour of the swamp. Now, the swamp, which is the interior of the park, there's some problem areas in the swamp. As you can see, at some point, somebody set up an encampment. If anybody would like a used gas grill, I can tell you where to go find it. Not really usable anymore. We do have a problem with old trash in the park. If anybody wants to use telephone or laundry tub, I can help you find that to recycle. There's a vernal pool right at the beginning. Zervis to show the kids the life that basically begins there. We have lots of skunk cabbage in the interior of the park. This is an amazing plant. The Wellesley counterpart to the Newton Conservators recently did an entire webinar just on this plant. Really amazing. Lots of ferns and mosses, Canada Mayflower, all kinds of beautiful plants that flower during the summer, where it attracts lots of bees, both bumblebees, native bumblebees, but as well many, many honeybees to the interior. It's one of my favorite places in the park. It's really quiet. It's also really wet. If you do go in there, make sure you wear shoes that you can deal with very wet spots in the interior of the park. We have lots of animals in the park, some of them very familiar, like this guy and the ducks. These are usually hang out near that part of the brook that floods behind the first bridge. Here's a muskrat, one of the vernal pools, cute little guy. A red fox. This is in actually an abutter's driveway across the street from the park, but I saw it leave the park and cross the street. Got there before I was able to get my camera out and get a picture of it. A long-tailed weasel, a picture that I took in the park. The weasel and its face poking itself out from where it was hiding in a crevice in a wall. There's some deer in the park, not a lot, but they do inhabit the park. We've seen them in all sections of the park throughout the year. And of course, coyotes, which we have all through Newton. This one was on the Beaconwood Trail, taken by our board member, Becky. And by the way, there's really important, the most important guidance on what to do if you see a coyote in the park. It's really published by the Charlton Police Department. It's really an emergency that you have to report to the police if you see a coyote exhibiting any of these behaviors, carrying a box marked Acme, chasing a road runner, etc., etc. Otherwise, just make noise and scare it away. Don't bother reporting it to the police. So you can report it on a website in Newton. Of course, we have amphibians. We have turtles, painted turtles, snapping turtles. We have 165 species of birds, including this beautiful barred owl, red-tailed hawk. We also have lots of invasive plants. This basically shows you invasive buckthorn, one of the earliest plants to leaf out, one of the last plants to lose its leaves. It's taken over about 90% of the swamp. Very nasty, invasive, that outcompetes virtually everything. Now, why is that important? This is a slide from Doug Tallamy, how birds and berries have co-evolved, where the birds rely on the native shrubs for berries. This amazing slide showing 4 native shrubs, 3 of which we have in the park. Not bayberry. And as you can see, these berries range from 24% to 50% fat. And these are the berries that emerge just in the fall when the birds are either needing to fatten up to migrate south or to fatten up to stay here for the winter. And these are the shrubs, all of which we have in Cold Spring Park, except the thick autumn olive, that are driving the native shrubs out. They range from less than 1% fat up to maybe 2.3% fat for bittersweet trees. They provide virtually no nutrition for the birds. Here's some honeysuckle in the park, bittersweet, which in addition to having those nutritionless berries also grow up and smother trees and bring them down. Japanese barberry can thin out both species and the number of insects, scrambling feeding relationships that ripple through the strands of the food web. They also are tick magnets, deer tick magnets. Fortunately, we have Catherine Howard, who's been leading invasive pulls both in Cold Spring Park and all around Newton for many years. This photo was on the most recent in Newton Serves Day. She's been leading really great efforts to help remove invasives from the park. We can't really hope to remove all the invasives, but we can hope to create at least spaces where the native plants can recover and thrive and help feed our animals, our birds, and our insects. This is an example of the Buckthorn Demonstration area where the volunteers have basically cleared the buckthorn. You can see Canada Mayflower recovering here. This is an experiment with basically cutting buckthorn and covering it with baggies. That only worked moderately well because we'd have rabbits or other rodents that chewed through a lot of the baggies. But this area still has very few buckthorn today. We're hoping that a lot of other native plants will recover there. Potential solution to our invasive problems, want to develop a management plan like one that was done for Manhattan Park in conjunction between the Newton Conservators and the city about 10 years ago to help prioritize invasive removal and restoration efforts. It'll evaluate habitats, identify those that have the most diversity, most worth preserving, but also those sections that will be most successful preserving and restoring. We've been talking to some potential consultants to do this. Estimated costs can range from $6,000 to $14,000, depending on the intensity of the work and whether they do a completed plant inventory. We're hoping that this may be the next project that we undertake after the aqueduct, but we'll be looking for feedback from people on that. Why is this important? Connecting back to the global context and a 2019 United Nations Global Biodiversity Report, our biodiversity is under threat worldwide. Ecosystem functions and services are deteriorating. 25% of all species on the planet are actually threatened by extinction this century. As you can see, there's been just in the last 40, 50 years, there's been a decline in many species. That's globally. Locally, a recent study by Cornell found that 3 billion birds in North America are essentially missing. That's 29%, down from only 40 to 50 years ago. Many species are declining at 1% per year or more, according to a National Academy of Sciences study released last year. And bumblebees and native bees are on the decline in Massachusetts. According to the research of UMass Dartmouth professor Rob Jagier, we've already lost 2 of 11 of our native bumblebee species. 3 more are at risk of being gone from the state within the next 10 years. We have 44 species of butterflies of conservation concern in Massachusetts, according to Mass Wildlife. These species are all the bottom of the food web. They feed our birds. They feed our small mammals. They feed our reptiles and amphibians. They pollinate our native plants, which provide the food again for the insects. If all of these decline, we're in trouble. This slide basically shows what the threats are to biodiversity. The light pollution in the upper left corner is a particular problem for some species like fireflies, but invasive species, a huge problem. Habitat loss, probably the biggest problem. Loss to agriculture, loss to lawns, loss to development, and pesticides also being a problem, and one which we'll soon be dealing with as an issue in our park and other parks, perhaps, as Parks and Recreation evaluates the likelihood of expanding their pesticide pilot program from last year from 3 playing fields to many other playing fields. So these are our local threats. These are the ones that we can do our part. And climate change, of course, as well, light pollution as well. Newton's doing really well with the climate change issue, taking on what we can take on, but we have a long way to go before we can really address these other threats to biodiversity. And by the way, we also have some insects that some scientists consider invasive that you'll find are quite surprising. But for that, you're going to have to read my letter to the Newton tab that was published today. Not going to go into it now, but hopefully we can all educate ourselves about some insects which we used to think were of conservation concern, but we now recognize are actually potential threats to some of our native bees in particular. And finally, the old softball field. This is a really interesting opportunity and threat. Not threat, really. The softball fields, it's still used occasionally for softball games. Used to be used virtually every night in the spring. It's now down to 4 to 5 games a year. There's no parking anywhere near it. You have to walk in from the Beacon Street parking lot, about a 15-minute walk. You're more likely to find parents teaching their kids sports or having a picnic in the softball field, or a Sufi dancer, or a solo birder, or a whole group of birders which frequent this area because the edge habitat, which has a lot of beautiful native sumacs and goldenrod and other native plants along the edges, provide really attractive food and habitat for birds. So it's a real prime bird watcher spot. There's some of the sumac berries on the side of the park, some of the goldenrod, the bumblebee. That's a generic stock photo, not one from actually in the park. So one of the questions we want to raise is what's really the best use of this old softball field? The city has for several years had a proposal in the capital plan to irrigate it and upgrade it as a softball field for $350,000. As you can tell, it's in terrible condition. But do we need more softball fields? Softball is a declining sport. This area is not big enough for lacrosse, soccer fields, which are the rising sports both in Newton and the state. We've got a brand new baseball, softball field in nearby Newton Highlands playground. So is it really the best use of the city's resources? Or should we just consider leaving it as is for whatever uses people want to make of it? Perhaps it could be a community garden, or perhaps it could be restored as a pollinator meadow. We really have very few pollinator meadows in Newton to support our diverse native insects, our bees, our butterflies, and other pollinators. This is, as you can probably tell, my favorite idea. It's one that ultimately will have to be decided, of course, by the city with lots of community input. Interested in your ideas on this issue as well. To sum up, we've made a lot of progress with trails, with invasive plants, with navigation, with providing information about the park, and beginning to really utilize it as an educational resource for people to experience and learn about nature. There's a lot of opportunities ahead, from reimagining the softball field to a management plan, fixing park access to service, and maybe some really long run ideas. What about the idea of an accessible boardwalk through the swamp? The mayor actually mentioned that in her last campaign. We don't see that as anything that might happen soon, and some people think we should just leave the swamp alone for the wildlife that lives there and the few intrepid visitors that go there today. What if the cemetery installed gates on Beacon Street and at the library, so you could do a continuous hike through Cold Spring Park all the way through the cemetery, past the library and City Hall to Bullows Pond? So what can you do to help Cold Spring Park? First, you could volunteer. We always need help picking up trash, and especially to remove the invasive plants that are threatening our park's native ecosystem. We have invasive pulls scheduled. Just send us an email at friendsofcoldspringpark@gmail.com, and we'll be glad to send you more details. There's a complete list of invasive pulls at parks all across Newton on the Newton Conservators website. They could all use our help. Second, consider planting more native plants in your yard. That way you can also help our at-risk pollinators. And if you plant some of the shrubs that are being forced out of the park by invasive glossy buckthorn, you can help us extend the park's habitat and preserve that habitat. And of course, you can always join our email list and/or make a donation at our website, coldspringpark.org. We depend on donations like yours to be able to continue to make improvements to the trail and to the habitat of the park. We'll be so grateful if you can help us. Or just join our email list so that we can keep in touch and let you know of upcoming park events and of our efforts to improve the park. You can join our Facebook page, like our Facebook page, and we update the page regularly. If you join our email list, you'll also have an opportunity to participate in future polls and surveys to help determine our priorities. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alan. That was absolutely amazing. You did a really wonderful job of bringing the park alive to all of us. Thank you. It's amazing. It's just absolutely amazing. Alan, it was your talking about trail work that got most questions at the very beginning. And John had to leave us, but he wants to know how the proposed dredging is going to affect the Cattail Marsh.
That's a great question, and we really don't have any idea. All I can tell you is, well, it doesn't extend into the Cattail Marsh, at least now, which is sort of off to the side and floods regularly. It's that will have to be evaluated by the Conservation Commission when the entire dredging project is proposed. The near-term project shouldn't affect that all that much. But it's a great question. We'll have to look into it more.
Okay. And in fact, one of our questions was just that, whether Concom had to weigh in on any work that's done.
Yes, they have to approve anything that's done, whether it's proposed by us or the city.
Terrific. We also have a question whether this flooding is needed by the nearby habitats.
Another great question that I don't entirely know the answer to. I mean, it is certainly possible that there'll be change to those habitats if there's a full dredging of the brook. The flooding that exists now is unfortunately not only a problem for the trail, but for the entire Beaconwood neighborhood, which has previously flooded and resulted in significant insurance claims over the years. The city, of course, is particularly concerned about that, as well as similar kinds of flooding in other areas of the city. So the dredging of Cold Spring Park was actually proposed as part of a 22-year plan the Department of Public Works has put together to look at all of the streams in Newton and basically perform their functions. But of course, there may very well be trade-off between limiting flooding and the interior of the park performing the wetland function that's so critical for filtering stormwater and providing the important ecological functions as the water makes its way through Cold Spring Brook, through the cemetery to Bellows Pond, and then on to the Charles River.
But there are two things. One, the flooding certainly has been worse in recent years than it was before.
Yes, and in fact, a major change has happened over the last 10 years as necessary repairs were made to the sewer system along Beaconwood Road. It turned out that the sewers were actually draining the Cold Spring Park brook and wetlands, resulting in enormous charges, through the MWRA. And as those repairs were made, water levels have been rising. Big changes in the water level up and down are obviously not great for the habitat. In the long run, one may argue that the brook should be restored to the level before the 1930s dredging. It could be daylighted instead of running underground in culverts through the old dog park and the softball field. But in our discussions, we've decided that kind of restoration is beyond the scope of it we'll be looking at in our lifetimes, at least in the return.
That was going to be my second point. You are not talking about a pure original habitat that hasn't had work done on it already. So it's very complicated, isn't it?
It is, and there's real trade-offs between recreation spaces. If it were restored to its original form, the dog park would be underwater, the old softball field would be underwater. Maybe that would be the best thing strictly from a wildlife perspective, but you would lose really important recreational amenities.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions from before, but we just got a long comment in that I think is related to this, so we'll look at it. Our attendee says, soon after I moved to Waban in the 1990s, I was interested to discover that the 1855 map of Newton shows the part of Beacon Street that borders Cold Spring Swamp on it as a proposed new road. Before it was built, people had to go around the swamp on its southern edge to get from Newton Center to Lower Falls. Waban didn't exist as a village yet. As still becomes clear in very wet weather, in this part of Beacon Street is essentially a causeway through the wetland. Has anyone researched the history of ecological impacts of this 19th century construction project?
Wow, great question. Not that I'm aware of. It is true that the entire, if you go back to the 1630s map, the entire area of Cold Spring Park and the cemetery was labeled Alcock's Swamp, and the later Cold Spring Park. And it actually states on that map that the legislature in 1630 declared that all swamps, or maybe it was even just open spaces over 100 acres, were to be held in common in perpetuity. Unfortunately, that didn't last. A lot of wetlands have been filled in Newton, as well as streams undergrounded. And this is an issue going forward. But the idea of restoring everything in Newton to its original habitat, clearly something that would be impossible.
A lot of us would be leaving town because our houses wouldn't be here. We have another water question, which is, why is there often orange-colored water at various spots?
I've been told that those are mostly natural tannins from vegetation that flow into the water and color it. Occasionally you can see what look like small oil slicks that are undoubtedly from stormwater runoff into the brook. The park drains a very, very large area. I think there all in all are 7 stormwater outfalls in the park. I haven't even seen most of them, but there are 3 of them right below Plymouth Road, and then the other one right near Zervis. That drain an enormous quantity of water into the park. Ideally, at some point, there might be some green infrastructure involved to help filter those stormwater outfalls, but a higher priority and a smart one has been installing such filters into some of the outfalls into Crystal Lake.
That's what I was going to say, exactly. Where it's done a great job. So with
yes,
and that was done with state funding. So maybe that can continue.
And hopefully expand.
Yeah. We have a question about the status of leachate from previous industrial uses. Do you know anything about that? You're getting a lot of tough questions here, Alan. I don't know.
Is this Mike Clark asking these historical questions?
No, this is our dear friend Larry Burdick. Always asks great questions.
I do not know anything about old industrial leachate. The only thing that I've seen on maps by way of an industrial facility, on Beaconwood Road, there used to be an ice factory in the middle of Beaconwood Road back in, I believe it was the early, like the 19-teens. Went bankrupt in the 1920s. Leftover leachate from.
Thank you. We do have a question about whether this webinar is being taped, and yes, there's a video being done, and once it's edited, it will be available, and we'll send everyone a notice to let them know it's available and where they can find it. And someone's how many days? It may take a while. Newton Conservators President Ted Kuklinski does the editing, and he's got a lot on his plate, but we will get there and we will let you know when it is there. We have another question from someone who's given us a couple of great questions, which is that he's noticed that some parts of trees where the wood is exposed under the bark are painted red. And he says, is this artwork? Is this trying to communicate something?
We don't know for certain, but we imagine that this was done by someone after some of the trees were nicked in the restoration of the stone dust surface last year. It used to be standard practice to paint nicks of tree roots and trunks over to help keep fungus and insects from attacking those wounds. It's now basically not considered current practice because it's found that these wounds heal much better better by themselves. So we imagine that this was a well-meaning person following old school advice. I will say that this year, part of the instructions to the contractor will be to wrap trees that are close to the aqueduct trail so that doesn't happen again. But we fully expect those trees to recover. Generally 95% of them do from those kinds of wounds, I am told.
Terrific. You are a wealth of knowledge. Thank you. Do we have more questions? We are out of questions, so I'll wait 1 second. Okay, we do have a wonderful question. Could you say a little bit about what it's been like to have such a long relationship with Cold Spring Park? It's something I aspire to, but you've got about a 50-year head start on her, Sarah says.
Well, I have to confess, I moved away from Newton for a long time after going to college in the area. After high school, I think in my 10th high school reunion, I won the door prize for having lived in the most places since then. But I moved back to the area in 1986. I was actually living in Brookline and coming to Cold Spring Park to walk my dog because it was an informal off-leash dog park and trail at that point. Moved back in 2003. Have been coming here pretty much every day, even try to get out in the worst weather. You know, it's a place that I just really love and appreciate and want to help give back to what the park's given me.
Great, that's awesome. Sarah writes amazing articles on environmental combination of personal interest in the environment. There you go, Sarah. You've got a perfect story for one of your next pieces. We do have a question from Donald Ross about when the next invasive pull is. Do you have that on the top of your mind, or should we include that in a message we send out tomorrow?
Let's include it in the message we send out tomorrow, but I'm pretty sure it's May 11th.
Okay. Terrific. We're doing socially distanced polls, and I'll include Catherine's information about the details of what we need to do, what everyone needs to do to be there for the poll.
Can I add, Beth, there'll be a couple of more throughout this year that I assume will be included in this list. And Catherine lined up 23 invasive polls all around the city this year. And you know, if Cold Spring Park isn't the closest, dearest park to you, please join any of them because all of our open spaces really need it badly.
They do. And she does unbelievable work and is busy continually. We all owe her incredible debt of gratitude.
Absolutely.
We have one more very specific question, and that is south of the Beacon Street parking lot, there is often oil sheen on the water. Where does that come from?
Yeah, I assume that is runoff. Could be from Beaconwood Road and the driveway there, you know, where it hooks around and goes to the brick apartment building. It could be from runoff basically in the neighborhood that's higher up, that drains into the vernal pool that then runs into that part of the brook. Fortunately, unfortunately, I'm not really sure about that. And if there's anything that we can really do about that, other than eventually hope that filters are installed in all the stormwater outfalls.
Terrific. And the last question comment we have is perfect from all of us. And it says, not a question. This has been fascinating. And it really has been. Even for those of us who know the park well, you just did an incredible presentation of showing all its splendors.
Well, thank you for providing the opportunity, Beth, and for all of your work and the conservators' work, maintaining not only Cold Spring Park, but all of our other green spaces in Newton.
We're all an incredible team, aren't we? We're all in it together. So thank you, everyone who's been here today, and we hope to see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.